All right.
Hey, Raph,
Yes, Aaron.
I had a quick question on rationalism versus mysticism. They talk about how some of the sages acquired knowledge, and it said because of fear of the Lord, they were
Yes.
able. I thought in Judaism they usually translated fear. Usually translated they meant awe of the Lord God.
Well, yes, but awe is an emotion that is rooted in an overwhelming sense of the awesomeness of whatever it is you are encountering. The awe a person feels at the edge of the Grand Canyon is mixed with a layer of fear, a feeling of insignificance. The awe we feel at a mountain the same way. So awe and fear are psychologically very deeply related, but it's not the fear like running away from the Freddy Krueger horror movie type fear. It's fear that is a much more natural type of experience, not the fear of life and limb, mortal danger from this particular thing. It's fear of basically having yourself be put in perspective and finding that you're very, very small and seemingly insignificant in that situation.
Yeah, that's the first time I've seen it quoted as fear in the Jewish context in a long time.
Well, I mean, that's partly because the word fear in modern English has moved almost exclusively into the fear of danger kind of emotion. When someone says they are afraid or that they felt fear, almost no one in modern English means that they felt anything like awe. But that's because English keeps changing. The biblical meanings and the rabbinic meanings are fixed as they were from 3,000 or 2,000 years ago. But the modern meaning of English keeps changing every year, little by little. So that's why new translations are always needed. All right. So I am afraid that we don't have any more time for that, but we need to get down to our very tasty discussion today. I'm going to warn you now, if you like cheese, but do not know how cheese was and or is made, and don't want to know about the process, you may want to skip a few minutes of this conversation, because we are going to deal with some rather interesting descriptions of the production of cheese. The short explanation of how cheese was made in the ancient world and how, although in a more chemical way, it has continued to be made, is cheese is milk that has been curdled, that has been caused to solidify, to stand up in the language of the Mishnah, the literal language of the Mishnah. And it is done so traditionally in the ancient world and traditional cheese making techniques by exposing it to a chemical that is found in the stomach and the stomach lining of an animal, what is called rennet in the modern terms. But make no mistake, it is basically a chemical that is leached from the stomach lining into the milk, and which causes the milk to go firm to varying degrees, depending upon the type of cheese that you're making. It is precisely the lack of rennet that makes soft cheeses, cream cheeses, creamy. That's also why, as we'll talk about, you will find many more soft cheeses with a hechsher than you will hard cheeses, because that's going to become an issue. But I just want you for the moment to prepare yourself for this issue as we've been talking about eating meat and milk, knowing now that cheese was made through a process that needed the lining of a stomach in order to turn the milk into cheese. You're probably wondering how we can have cheese at all, because that seems like you are quite literally mixing milk and meat, that you are absolutely using the meat of the stomach lining, in this case, to make the cheese. And we are going to talk about that some, and we're also going to talk about some other rather interesting repercussions of the various milk found in the stomach of different animals. So that is the short version of cheese making. We're going to probably cover it a little bit more as we go along. And I apologize for people that didn't realize how cheese used to be made. We will talk about how cheese is more often made by the end of this discussion of this Mishnah. So we are on chapter 8, Mishnah number 5 of Chullin. And the introduction, I already basically gave you Rabbi Kolb's version. So let's get down to the text of the Mishnah. The milk in the stomach of an animal, right? So the Hebrew itself only talks about the stomach, but it is clear from both context as well as from the discussion that is found in the Talmud that we are actually talking about the milk of the stomach, not the stomach itself. The stomach itself, as you can imagine, is considered to be the meat, the flesh of the animal. And obviously what we're about to say would not make any sense if that was the only thing we were talking about. So the milk in the stomach of an animal, of a Gentile, or in the stomach of a Nevilah is forbidden. And we're going to walk that back by the end of our discussion. And in fact, there's a whole long discussion in the Talmud of this being an initial position of one rabbi who later retracted his opinion and went in a different way. But for the moment, let's just work with how the Mishnah is written. That the milk that's in the stomach of the animal that belongs to a non-Jew, or of an animal that was not slaughtered and instead just died, or not slaughtered properly, and so it's considered nevelah, that milk is prohibited. Because, the animal, it can't be eaten, so the milk that is sloshing around in its stomach can't be eaten either. That is the position that we are, at least for the moment, hypothetically holding up. Yes, Aaron?
Is the reason that an animal, the Gentile, the milk is prohibited is because it's presumed that Shlita was not performed correctly?
Exactly. I mean, if a Jewish butcher, a shochet, had done Shlita and it was a kosher animal, of course, to begin with, then that wouldn't be an issue. We're talking about an animal that was just killed by a Gentile, or a nevelah, meaning an animal killed by a Jew but done incorrectly. There was a discussion again in the Talmud about whether or not this is talking about the same issue, but we're not going to get into that because if you want that, we'll do Talmud class sometime. But yes, we are basically assuming that Shlita was not done, therefore the animal is prohibited. And at the moment, for the sake of argument, this position in the Mishnah is saying, therefore, the milk inside of it is also prohibited. Now remember, this is the milk in the stomach, which means the animal has recently drunk this milk. It wasn't produced by this animal, it was produced by another animal. But at the moment, we're saying that that milk, even though it is just milk, is prohibited because the animal wasn't slaughtered. And that, of course, is why it would need to be stated, because you might have thought, and indeed we're going to walk this back in a second, but you might have thought that because the milk inside the animal was just recently drunk, or else it would have already passed through to the other layers of digestion, that milk still counts as milk. If I cut open a cow and I find a gold ring, that doesn't count as the meat of the animal, that counts as a gold ring. And I'm very, very happy about it and wondering how the cow ate it. But at the moment, we are saying that the milk counts as the animal rather than an ancillary product that happened to have been collected in the animal-shaped vessel that you just killed. All right. Part 3. If a man curdled milk, which remember, this is the way you did it in the ancient world, with the skin of the stomach of an animal that was validly slaughtered, and it imparted its flavor to the milk, it is forbidden. So, as I mentioned, this was the way you made cheese or other type of thicker dairy products, not counting butter, but other types of dairy products, like other cheeses that need a curdling, souring of the milk. You would put it into the skin of the stomach of an animal, or you would mix it with that skin, having saved pieces from another animal. If it actually changes the flavor of the milk, then the milk is now prohibited because of the prohibition on mixing between meat and milk. Everyone with me so far? Good. Part 4. the milk in the stomach of a validly slaughtered animal, which has suckled from a treifa animal, is forbidden. The milk in the stomach of a treifa animal, which had suckled from a kosher animal, is permitted because the milk is collected inside. So this is where we are sort of flipping our initial commentary about the milk counts as the animal, because as you can see, the milk that is collected inside the stomach is considered to have come from whatever that animal was suckling on, right? Thus, if it's found in the animal that was validly slaughtered, but it is known that the milk came from a treifa, meaning an animal that we weren't supposed to eat because we knew that it was going to die from its mortal wound or defect, then that milk is prohibited because it's considered to be part of the animal that produced it, not the animal that drank it. And vice versa, even if the animal that drank it was treifa, if it came from an animal that wasn't, meaning a regular kosher animal, you are able to take the milk out of the belly of that treifa animal, meaning it's soon to die from the mortal wound or issue, and use it because it's just collected there. It's just like a cow-shaped barrel that happens to have the milk of a kosher animal inside of it. Now, first of all, any questions on that before we return to cheeses? Okay, so as cheese production has become more and more refined and modernized, really over quite a long period, we find commentators, as Rabbi Kolb points out, in the Middle Ages and onward, treating the rennet that is used as being less and less meat-like, considering it really as the phrase "eitz ba'alma," like it's just like wood, even though it was originally meat. Now it has been transformed into this chemical substance rather than a fleshy substance. And as such, there are many more opinions on exactly what types of cheeses can and can't be eaten. In the conservative movement, there is an opinion, a tshuva, that can be found on the Rabbinical Assembly website, which talks about using rennet for making cheese. And the upshot of it, although I advise you to go read it so you can go through the ins and outs of the discussion, the upshot is that if the cheese is made in a modern facility using the milk of a kosher animal, meaning from an animal that is a cow or goat or sheep, technically deer, giraffe, but that's pretty unlikely you're going to get a lot of giraffe cheese. That provided it doesn't have any additional ingredients or other modifications, it can be presumed to be kosher and fine for use. This is one place in the realm of kashrut where the conservative movement disagrees with the opinion of many Orthodox poskim. And as you can imagine, this causes some argumentation. But if you read through the tshuva, you'll find that it is very, very well grounded within the development of halakha, going back a couple thousand years from the discussion of how cheese gets made in the first place. But we don't really have time to go through it blow by blow. If people are ever interested, maybe I can do that for another one of my responsa classes on the different tshuvot from Jewish law. But for tonight, we'll have to leave it there. Okay. Mishnah number 6. As he points out, this is our last Mishnah, and it's not talking about milk and meat at all. It changes the topic. But we are talking about other forbidden substances. In this particular case, we are talking about forbidden fat, chelev, and we are talking about blood. Chelev is the particular fat that is found in certain abdominal areas of an animal, mammal, that is prohibited for our use because it was reserved only for use on the altar of Jerusalem. And as such, we are not allowed to eat it. So that means that it has to be removed by the butcher after the animal has been slaughtered. The blood, too, as we have talked about, also needs to be removed through the different steps that have been that we've covered. Okay, but here we're going to compare the different prohibitions that are applicable for the fat and that are applicable for the blood. Again, a reminder, the chelev doesn't mean every fat. It means the very particular regions of abdominal fat that the butcher has to remove and which were reserved for temple use. In certain respects, the prohibition of the fat is stricter than the prohibition of the blood. And in certain respects, the prohibition of the blood is stricter than the prohibition of the fat. All right, a very common format that is used in many different Mishnahs. It says A is sometimes more than B, and B is sometimes more than A, trying to refine our understanding of each of them, but also to remind us that just because something is stricter than something else in one aspect doesn't mean that it is always stricter in every aspect, that each one has to be handled according to the laws that govern it. So, how does that work? The prohibition on the fat is stricter in that. Let me see if I can get my English out tonight. The prohibition of the fat is stricter in that the fat is subject to the law of sacrilege, and one is obligated over it for pigul, notar, and uncleanness, which is not the case of blood. So, if you eat the forbidden fat, then you have committed a transgression that is considered sacrilege. It is, me'il is the technical term, and it means that you have misused sacred property. The same thing would happen if you were to steal a cow that had been designated for an offering and eat it as well. That is also the same kind of problem. Since the fat is supposed to be up on the altar, you can't eat it because it is supposed to be on the altar. And if you do eat it, not only have you eaten something you weren't supposed to, but you have also taken something that belonged to the altar that was sanctified, and that is a separate transgression. As Rabbi Kolp points out, also we have this issue of pigul, which is where a Kohen, a priest, while offering the sacrifice, intends to eat it after it may no longer be eaten. This is a transgression of kavanah, that while preparing the sacrifice, he is planning to eat it at the wrong time, beyond the window of opportunity, and different sacrifices can have different windows. And that turns it into pigul, which means that it is unavailable, it's improper to use at this point. Notar is when you have a leftover piece of a sacrifice that has been left over the appropriate time period and thus can no longer be eaten. And like he says, if somebody has eaten something that was pigul or that was notar, you have again transgressed the specific requirements of those two. And of course, if you eat it while you are unclean, then you are also transgressing the laws against coming into contact with something that is sacred in a state of uncleanliness. So none of those apply to blood. That doesn't mean that one should do them when eating blood, because obviously one shouldn't be eating blood at all either. Both of these are forbidden in the first place. But if one were to eat blood from a sacrifice that was pigul, notar, or while they were unclean, they would not be transgressing those particular categories of transgression. On the other hand, let's get this right down to the top of the page. And the prohibition of the blood is stricter, for it applies to cattle, wild animals, and fowl, whether clean or unclean, but the prohibition of fat applies to clean cattle only. So when it comes to avoiding the eating of blood, we avoid eating the blood whether it comes from any of these animals, as we have talked about before. Only the blood of the permitted locusts or fish is allowed to be eaten. But the prohibition for the forbidden fat only applies to permitted cattle. Now, cattle here is a more technical English term, meaning sheep, goats, and cows, not only cattle like only cows in the modern American sense. So it doesn't apply to a wild animal like a deer, and it doesn't apply to birds. So if you eat the comparable fat from a bird or from a deer that would normally be permitted if it was a sheep, goat, or cow, you have not transgressed this commandment. But If you eat the blood of those wild things or of the domesticated things or of birds, you have transgressed. So for some things, the forbidden fat is stricter. For some things, the blood is stricter. But again, a reminder, for both of them, you're not allowed to eat them in the first place at all. All right, questions or comments? Okay, it's either completely incomprehensible or perfectly comprehensible. Either way, we're moving on to chapter 9. All right. Uncleanliness. This is something that I know many of us are not as perfectly familiar with. Some maybe not even that interested in, but it is a very interesting aspect of Jewish law, and it does come in many different gradations and varieties. And we're going to talk about two different versions here that are what is called food uncleanliness and nevela uncleanliness. As Rabbi Kolp points out, food that is unclean can cause other food to become unclean if there is the amount of an egg of food, whereas nevela uncleanliness is a minimum of an olive's worth, which is considerably less. And the egg and the olive are two of the standard measures for smallish amounts in Jewish law. But as you can see, they are different. Now, the question then becomes, what do the different parts of an animal count as? Because in order for it to fall into the category of food uncleanliness, then we're going to actually have to see it as food. And that's going to be important. Yes, Aaron.
And Rabbi, when this makes other food unclean, is it by contact or touching?
Yes, exactly. No rubbing of these foods against something else. That is to say, no rubbing of an unclean piece of food against a clean piece of food, because you're not going to be able to eat it at that point. Okay. Excuse me. So here is our first list. The hide, meat juice, sediment, dried up meat, bones, sinews, horns, and hooves joined together to make up the minimum quantity in order to convey food uncleanliness, but not to make up the minimum quantity in order to convey nevela uncleanliness. Okay, so we don't need to go into all the technical elements of these different pieces of the animal, but the general idea here is that those aren't usually food. Like, you don't go around chewing on a horn, generally speaking. Technically, a person can. It requires a lot of work, but technically they can. But the question here is, if I take a little bit of the leg and a little bit of the shoulder, even if each of them is less than an egg, if I put them together and it makes more than an egg, then obviously that counts as food. It doesn't have to be an egg worth of leg, an egg worth of shoulder. But what about these other, not really food parts of an animal, but nonetheless might still be food-ish parts of the animal? And the Mishnah is telling us that, yes, these other elements of the animal can, if combined, create that minimum measure of a food uncleanliness. So if you have an egg's worth of bones of the animal, then those bones, if they are unclean, will transfer that uncleanness, I'm just a mistake with uncleanliness, to anything else they touch or to other food that they touch. On the other hand, if you have an olive's worth, it still does not count as nevela uncleanliness, because these elements are not considered part of the basar, the flesh of an animal. And as such, they don't count as part of its corpse. And we're going to get into the conversation about using the parts of an animal that aren't food and what that status is in Judaism. Most notably, the topic of leather, because, well, leather is rather important, especially in the ancient world, as a material. So for the moment, just to get through part 2 here, understand that these things can add up to transfer the uncleanliness of food, but no matter how much you have, they do not add up to transfer the uncleanliness that comes from a corpse.
Rabbi, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
I thought, is there a requirement that these things be wet to transfer impurities? Because that's what I was always told.
For most produce, things have to be wet, but meat is not produce. So your wheat, your apples, your grapes, all of those things have to be moistened by one of the appropriate liquids, and then they become susceptible to and then transferring uncleanliness. But meat doesn't have that same issue because, well, it's built-in moisture, if you will. All right. Similarly, if a man slaughtered an unclean animal for a Gentile, so you are the butcher and you are butchering a pig for a non-Jew, and it still has convulsions, it can convey food uncleanliness, but it conveys nevela uncleanliness only after it is dead or its head has been chopped off, right? So obviously, we can't eat this because, it's an unclean animal. And obviously it can't be eaten by the Gentile because while it's still convulsing, it's still alive. And one of the Noahide laws is that you are not allowed to eat a limb, meaning any part of an animal that is removed while the animal is still alive. Nonetheless, even though it is not food yet, because it's still kicking, it counts as being able to transfer food uncleanliness. It is still able to receive that impurity. Now, this may not be all that important because it's probably not of interest to the non-Jew, and quite likely it's not going to be in a place of conveying impurity that the Jew would concern with, but this is the law and thus has to be discovered. However, it doesn't become nevela and thus convey nevela uncleanliness until it is actually dead, right? Or its head's been removed, and even if it's still kicking around, the chicken in the barnyard kind of thing, that if you have killed it, then now, yes, it does become nevela, it does become a corpse, and as such, it transfers the corpse impurity, the animal corpse impurity. The corpse of a human body is a very different degree. Okay, part 4. Scripture, meaning Torah, has thus made more cases that convey food uncleanliness than those that convey nevela uncleanliness. Right? It is easier to hit the food uncleanliness threshold than it is to hit the nevela threshold for uncleanliness. Rabbi Yehuda argues, if an olive's bulk of dried up meat was gathered in one place, one would thereby become liable for nevela uncleanliness. Now, he is arguing about what we said back up in the first paragraph with that list. And he argued that dried up meat should be counted as gathered together, as joining up, as adding up, meaning if you have, a gram here and a gram there and put them together, that it adds up to being the minimum measure, that should reach that threshold for dried meat, should be counted as nevela of the corpse dish. Now, this is important. Dried up meat here doesn't just mean beef jerky. Dried up meat here means that meat that is completely shriveled and no longer really considered edible, unlike beef jerky, which I was very pleased to see that the Winn-Dixie had kosher beef jerky the last time I was there. And I'm a sucker for beef jerky, and it's very hard to find kosher beef jerky. Okay, so that finishes off 9.1. Questions or comments before we get to 9.2 and we continue with our flesh? Okay. Now,
Actually, I have a comment.
oh yes, go ahead.
Why does the extra dried up meat count towards passing contamination and the slightly dried up does not?
Why does the extra dry but the slightly dry doesn't? I'm not sure what you mean by slightly dried.
You said that dried up meat, you said dried up to the part that it's inedible. Why did he make a special comment on that?
Oh, because the part that isn't dried up to be inedible, the beef jerky, obviously joins together to make food uncleanliness.
All right, that makes sense.
Right. The list is the things that you normally wouldn't think of as food, but nonetheless do still count as part of food uncleanliness if they reach a minimum quantity. Even if it's a little bit of hide, a little bit of sediment, a little bit of bones, and altogether it equals that egg, that is still okay. But things that are definitely food, like regular dried beef jerky, you don't have a question. They obviously add together to make that minimum measure.
And Rabbi, just on a side note of modernization, most people would say this list changes as you change time and community as to what counts as food and not food, or is that not correct?
So I'm. It's a good question because I have to admit I'm not enough of a butcher and I'm not enough of a food connoisseur to know whether or not many of these products are considered to be truly food or not. Now, I know things like bones can often be used to create soup stock, and I know that hooves can be used to create gelatin and used as that binding agent. So I'm not sure whether the rabbis here were talking about just the bones and hooves as they were, as opposed to deliberately adding them to a substance, because I'm not sure exactly how these were and were not cooked in the ancient world. So I'm out of my depth when I get to that part of the kitchen.
Right, and the reason I came to that conclusion was I thought the first part of the Mishnah said they combine some of those things combined with extra food because you eat them together. So I took that to mean that must be that culture would sometimes eat that stuff with regular food, and that's why they counted. But if they didn't eat them together, it seems to indicate that they would not have counted it.
Well, they definitely would not be part of the normal count. As we're going to see, things like bones do not normally count in these categories, neither for food nor for nevela. So yes, it is when they begin to get to the edge of edible thresholds, I would guess would be a way of putting that. But I'm not sure whether the rabbis consider that to be cultural or more to the fact that if they are, edible in your culture, then they are, whether you're eating that or not. But it's an interesting question. Personally, I'm not a big fan of eating any of these things or their derivatives, but that may be another topic for another conversation. There is a long discussion about hooves, for example, and gelatin, because the famous issue of marshmallows. For people that desperately want to have marshmallows, they need to understand that gelatin is usually made from the bones and hooves of animals, and usually, of course, not kosher and not kosher slaughtered, which is why you need to look for a hechsher certification on marshmallows, and it is very hard to find, except for some particular marshmallows. And having grown up not keeping kosher, I will tell you that kosher marshmallows don't taste as good as non-kosher marshmallows. But I will also tell you I feel a lot better eating kosher marshmallows, knowing that I'm not eating boiled hooves that have been spun together with sugar. No matter how tasty that may be, once I realized how they were made, it did kind of put me off. All right, Mishnah 2 from chapter 9. We are continuing on with skin. Now, skin is generally not considered flesh, at least as with regards to nevela, uncleanliness. Obviously, if you sit down to eat it, you are still transgressing. But the issue here is whether or not skin that is being removed and has been removed from the corpse, whether that still counts as the corpse, or whether the corpse is focused entirely on the meat. In general, we find that it is focused entirely on the meat and not the skin. But are there cases where the skin does continue to have the same impurity like the actual meat? That's our topic for Mishnah 2. In the following cases, the skin is considered flesh, meaning that even though skin in general is not considered to still be part of the meat, for some categories, the skin is the meat regardless of whether it's been removed or anything else has gone on with it. What is that? The skin of a person, the skin of a domesticated pig. Rabbi Yosef says even the skin of a wild pig, the skin of the hump of a young camel, the skin of the head of a young calf, the skin around the hooves, the skin of the pudenda, the skin of a fetus, meaning from inside the animal when you slaughter it, the skin beneath the fat tail, the skin of the gecko, the monitor, the lizard, and the skink, part of the category of asherets, of the creepy crawlies. And Rabbi Yehuda says the lizard is like the weasel. So in all of these cases, the skin is just like the muscle tissue meat underneath and is has the same effect as whatever the meat would have. In all of these cases, it's treated like that, except for the human, because the skin was considered edible. Like prima facie, regardless of how you cook it, the skin from the hump of a young camel or a young calf was all considered to be food, straight up, first and foremost, and oftentimes was considered enjoyable. And in those cases, it is forbidden as the same as the meat of the creature itself.
Rabbi.
Now, yes, go ahead.
Did you just say that they're eating the skin as a meal?
Well, whether it's eating it just by itself or eating it with something else, yes, it was edible and was commonly edible, I guess you would say.
But they also use the skin to make stuff like wine holders to hold wine, and they're applying the same rule to the skin you eat as to the skin you use to make stuff with. Is that correct?
No. So what's happening here is they're saying skin usually does not count as the meat of an animal. It's not normally the nivela. But this skin does count as though it were the meat, because this skin is very often eaten just straight by itself, not like only under emergency situations. So therefore, this skin could not be used for other things. And I suppose all of us are probably glad, we'll go back to the first one on the list. Otherwise, it would mean the skin of a person could be taken off and used and turned into leather and used for any other purposes. And indeed, there was an argument in the Talmud that perhaps the Torah itself did not explicitly prohibit the use of skin of a person in that way, but the rabbis categorically prohibited it from the community, lest people take the skin of their mother and father and turn them into rugs. And that obviously would fill us with revulsion, and the rabbi said, no, it is considered just like the flesh, and the flesh is prohibited with the uncleanliness of the dead and all the way through. So apart from the skin of a person, the skin of these other creatures are generally considered to be food, and thus are prohibited regardless of what you do to prepare them. But we are going to see that you can prepare it in a special way, or not in a special way, but in a sufficient way in order to de-foodify it, to remove it completely from the food category. And that's what part 3 is going to say. If any of these skins was tanned or trampled upon as much as was for tanning, it becomes clean, excepting, as we talked about, the skin of a man. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says the 8 reptiles have real skins, which means they don't convey that category and could also be used, the sheretzim. But the issue that we have here is that you can take those other skins and recognizing that they are nevela until you have tanned them or pounded them until they would be ready for tanning, then they can be considered just cloth or just material, and no longer are considered to be part of the carcass, and thus are not transmitting the impurity of nevela. Just to point out, normal skin does not require these extra steps to reach that stage. Normal skin automatically has that status, although, of course, normal skin would also usually end up being tanned and prepared as leather. Yes, Aaron.
So, nevela is just unclean to eat, right? It's not that it has an impure status, or it does because it can transmit impurity.
No, it does. It does have an impure status. The body of a nevela does have an impure status.
So when you transfer it so that it's no longer nevela, it's becoming from impure to not impure?
Exactly. It's going from being impure to neutral when you go through the tanning, the leather making process. Just not for human skin, which is always off limits no matter what you do. All right. Now, having talked about the skin, we are continuing with that topic here in Mishnah number 3 about exactly how much does the skin still need to be attached or detached for the animal for when it no longer is considered to be part of the impurity of the flesh of the carcass. Like, at what point is it considered separate? And that may sound odd to us, but to anyone who has ever gone hunting and flayed an animal, to remove the skin from an animal, they can understand precisely what's going on here. You're disconnecting the skin. Excuse me, something in my eye. You are disconnecting the skin from the flesh underneath. At what point in the process of removing it does it just become a piece of skin that happens to still be kind of attached? And at what point is, from just the beginning of the removal, is it still mostly part of the animal because you've only made a little bit of a separation? That's where we are. That's the dividing line that we are trying to discover. One who was flaying, that means removing the skin from the meat of the animal, was flaying cattle or wild animals, clean or unclean, small or large, in order to use the hide for a covering, meaning to turn it into something that is just skin and no longer part of the flesh. If he stripped as can be taken hold of, the hide is no longer considered as connected to the flesh. So once you have been able to peel back enough skin that you can get 2 handholds on it, is the general rule that gets discussed, then it is considered to be now just skin that happens to still be attached. Even though it is technically connected, it's going to be treated for any issues of impurity as though it were disconnected at that point. You've already made enough of a start as to signify that separation, and now you're just finishing the job. However, that's only if you are just stripping off the skin in order to use it as a general piece of leather. Part 4, in order to make a water skin, which has a different style of skinning, of flaying, where you would cut a small hole and in the area around the neck, and then you would scrape the skin away from the meat all around, like inside, in order to keep the whole skin intact as much as possible, in order to create an actual like watertight skin container. Then you have to disconnect the skin from the underlying meat up until the breast at least. So going from neck down to the chest in order for it to be considered as a separate entity, because that is a much harder separation to make. and the process is going to be a little bit trickier. And so the threshold for making it a separate entity is a little bit harder. And if he was flaying from the feet upwards, meaning starting from the feet and going up the legs, then until the whole hide has been flayed. This is the harder version altogether. And at this point, you need to work the skin off of the meat all the way around the entire animal before it is considered to be a disconnected entity. And as we see in part 6, all of these measures apply for both conveying uncleanliness and becoming unclean, right? This is in any direction, from hide to animal, animal to hide. This is where we are trying to find that dividing line. Now we get a slightly different opinion. As for the skin that is on the neck, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says it is not connected. But the sages say it is connected until the whole hide has been flayed. The skin around the neck for most animals, as you probably have noticed, and maybe even yourself you might have felt, seems to be a little bit disconnected, as though it were hanging loose. Look at a turkey if you like, or even at the drooping part under the neck of a cow to get an idea of what's being discussed here. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, yeah, that skin's like pre-separated already. It's already should be counted as not connected because it's just dangling and not really there. But the sages say, no, it is still considered connected until it has been flayed for the entire thing. That it still has the status of whatever it is attached to until the skinning process has been completed. Questions on Mishnah 3?
Yes, Rabbi. Can you explain the difference again to when you need 2 hands to remove it versus when you need to remove the whole thing?
Yes. So if you are just stripping off parts of the hide in order to use it for leather, so you make a cut on the legs and a cut across the neck and a cut across the back, and you're just going to peel back the whole backside, like your classic image of the skin of an animal, where it looks like someone just pulled it off the animal, because that's what they're doing, although, with knives and other scrapers involved. Once you have removed enough of it that you have purchase to keep that process going, then whatever happens, that piece of skin is considered separate, and the piece of animal, the meat of the animal is considered separate, and they can transmit back and forth to each other, or can be separate depending upon what comes into contact with one or the other. But that's only for general removal. Sorry, that was actually part up in here in part 3. In part 4, the rabbis are discussing a specialized type of removal, which is the water skin technique or goal, where they are trying to remove the hide in one whole piece. The idea is to leave it as intact as possible in order to preserve the watertight nature of the animal's skin, because once you have removed it and you've then tanned it and turned it into leather, you can fill that up with water and it will hold it. After all, my skin's holding in all my water very nicely. So if I can just peel that skin off, it'll make a wonderful sack. They didn't have Tupperware back then. They didn't have bottles that were easily available, and certainly not for larger quantities. So using that type of skin for containing the water was a very useful thing. But because it is harder to make that process, and because the connection is very fiddly around the neck area and then pushing down through the chest, you had to get further into the animal in that separating process as you're scraping between the meat and the skin before it would be considered separated enough to be considered its own entity. And starting at the feet and going upwards was even more difficult, and thus the threshold was even higher before separation could be considered as having occurred. And in fact, you had to get all of it off before you could make that statement. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps a lot. So if you, it sounds like in general removal, well, let me take that back. If you messed up while doing that water skid removal, you could transfer it to a general removal or no?
Yeah. You can downgrade very easily if you like are trying carefully to remove the skin to make it into a water container, and your scraper pokes through the shoulder, and now there's like a giant gash in it. You're like, ah, well, fine. You just grab your knife, you slice it open, and you just begin flaying off the strips as you can to make leather. And now, yeah, you've moved back into general removal territory, and you're no longer in the water skin situation.
One final question. Is there an intent behind this? So you have to intend to remove this to use it for leather versus any kind of meal or something?
Um, you mean if you're removing the skin, but your plan is, I'm going to eat this, does that create a different category? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, because it seemed like, and maybe I'm just confused with the different animals, but it seemed like a lot of the stuff you removed, and they said because it theoretically could be edible or something, um, it still um, it still can contract impurities.
Well, I mean, it can still contract impurities because it's an object. If I make a
A
leather
vessel.
jacket, the leather jacket can still become impure. So that's just any object can become impure. Well, almost any object. Um,
A
Stone and
vessel
glass,
could come impure, right? Any vessel.
any vessel, right? Any vessel, or clothing for that matter, can become ritually impure. So that's the a generic issue. But generally speaking, yes, we're talking about an animal that the skin was not intended to be used as food. If you were cutting up the animal and your plan was to save the skin because it was going to be really good in the stew, then yes, I guess the skin would be considered flesh during that process of preparing your stew. But in general, what we're talking about here is removing skin that's intended to become leather.
Like a good example might be a pig skin. I mean, I'm not sure if that's edible or not, but obviously that has generic use too for like football.
Yeah, but actually, pigskin is considered edible by many people, and it is considered to be quite the treat for many people. Crackling is the term for it, and fried pigskin is considered very tasty by many people. It's not something I've ever had, even in my pre-kosher days. I wasn't really keen on pig, but from what I understand, many people do like eating the skin of pigs.
So if you're removing the pig skin, whether or not it can still contract Nevelah would be determined by intent then, right, or no?
If you're removing it to eat, then you're already in trouble because you shouldn't be doing that as a Jew. But if you were removing it in order to transform it into leather, then yes, that would put it in a different category.
I thought you could remove it to serve to somebody else who wasn't Jewish.
Uh, Technically, yes. If your job was to butcher everything that came through, and obviously you were keeping your knives separate between the two different types of animals, then yes. But it would be considered as the carcass itself, and it would not become part of the skin. But remember here, we're talking not whether or not it can or can't be made impure, but whether or not its status of purity is separate from the status of the underlying animal.
Isn't there also an issue of whether or not it can contract Nevelah impurity versus just regular impurity?
Right, and then transmit between the two. Yes.
All right, that makes
All
sense.
right.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Just need to remind myself if we can get through this. Yeah, we got 5 minutes. We can do that. All right, let's power our way through 9.4. All right, so 9.4 is continuing our discussion of the skin, and we are dealing with, again, the term flesh as meaning the meat, as opposed to the skin itself. A hide, the skin, which has an olive's bulk of unclean flesh clinging to it, one who touches a shred hanging from it or a hair that was opposite to it becomes unclean. So it's unclean flesh, but that's way down here on this part of the hide, and I touch the other part of the hide. It's still considered to be connected because of that piece of meat, which renders the entirety of the hide as though it were still part of the carcass, not hide, because of that olive piece that's there. Obviously, you can then scrape that off, and we're back and fine. But that is where we are. That's where we are. Good. If there were two pieces of flesh attached to it, each the size of half an olive, they convey uncleanliness by carrying, but not by contact. Because when you, so according to Rabbi Ishmael, because his opinion is when you pick up the whole hide, you are carrying both of them, which means they add together to make that olive size, and boom, now we have that impurity. But just touching it on the ground doesn't, because you're not touching both of the pieces, they don't combine. Rabbi Akiva says, neither by contact nor by carrying, that because it is a minimum's worth, or below the minimum's worth for both of them, that it does not count as being enough, even if you were to pick up the entire hide and carry both of the two pieces simultaneously. But Rabbi Akiva does agree that if there were two pieces of flesh, each of them the size half of an olive, and he stuck on a twig and he waved them, then he does become unclean, right? So Rabbi Akiva does agree that in certain cases that they can be joined together. That if you deliberately attach them basically to each other by using that stick, pushing a barbecue skewer through them, then you have joined them up to become that minimum measure of an olive. And by waving them, meaning carrying them, you have become impure. But why then does Rabbi Akiva declare him clean in the case where they cling to the hide? Because the hide renders them negligible. So he agrees that if you just put it on a stick, that counts as enough. But because they are two insignificant pieces next to the entirety of the entire piece of hide, the entire leather, therefore the leather basically renders them of no consequences because they are of such minute amounts in that balance. And as such, carrying a hide with two small pieces is not a problem, but carrying a stick with two small pieces would cause impurity. And we will leave Mishnah 5 for next week as we talk about bones. Any questions on Mishnah 4 before we wrap up? All right, then good night, everyone. Have a wonderful meal. I hope people enjoy despite learning about this. Remember, our ancestors had to live up to their elbows in the bodies of their animals in order to live. If you don't fancy that, then be very grateful for the modern world.